Hi, I want to share with you my thoughts about 5 levels of consciousness. But before we go into those 5 levels, we have to ask the question of just what is consciousness? It's a tricky problem. It's been there in philosophy for many years. It's got more and more interesting now because we're asking ourselves, can machines become conscious? There are different words to explain that word. There is, for example, we call it sentience. And we ask the question of at what point can we say that a machine is conscious? And let me give you this. Consciousness is a personal experience. So before we came to the idea of artificial intelligence, we asked the question of, do animals have consciousness? And of course, in a much more ancient world, we call this the soul. Do animals have a soul? There are people who used to say that slaves didn't have souls, so they don't have to be treated as human beings. Our essence of treating another human being like ourselves is the idea or the notion that that person also experiences the world the way I experience it. Frankly, we don't know. We don't have any proof about it. But that is what consciousness is. At least I know I'm conscious. I know I'm aware of the world around me. So what is consciousness? Do animals have consciousness? Do robots have consciousness? Do other people have consciousness? How do I know I do not experience their consciousness in the way that I experience my own consciousness? And if this isn't bad enough, we have other words for consciousness. There's the word sentience. It's used in artificial intelligence, but I think it's a lot more popular in the issue of science fiction. We talk about sentience. At what point does a machine become self-aware, consciousness? Of course, we will go into the question of whether self-awareness is consciousness. That's a separate issue. We'll go there a little later. So I'm not going to define it. I'm hoping that by now you understand this question. Some philosophers call it qualia. Qualia is my experience that of the world and of myself that I'm feeling right now. It's qualia. And of course, the problems of cognitive science, the ultimate problem of cognitive science is the gap between, how do I explain this? There's a gap between all the processes that we have. We talk about the brain, we talk about memory, we talk about all these processes, and the gap between that and what I experience. Because it seems to me that my experience of things cannot be broken down into processes, into chemicals. Even if I understand every single chemical reaction that's happening in the brain, which we are very far from understanding at the moment, will that explain consciousness? We don't know. On the other side, there are those who think that consciousness is something which is very different from human body, something like a ghost in a machine, right? Consciousness is a ghost in a machine, and machine, of course, is my body, and that's what machines, and we look at it as a machine. But the physical changes do impact our consciousness. Somebody pinching me, I sense the pain. It's a physical act of pinching, but I sense the pain. So it's not that these are completely isolated worlds. They are connected, right? So the 5 levels of consciousness, when we study consciousness, different people have different ways of explaining things. Sometimes people say, let's take a look at how we are conscious during the day. Like, for example, when we are sleeping, when we are asleep, what kind of consciousness do we have? Or when we are in intense pain, is our awareness of ourselves fundamentally different from when we didn't have that pain? So consciousness means, when we're talking about different levels of consciousness, sometimes people look at consciousness as something that is at different times, different kinds of experience would be different levels of consciousness, which of course in Eastern philosophy we talk about different levels of consciousness, including a higher state of consciousness and a lower state of consciousness. That's one way of looking at it. That's not what we're looking at right now. Right now, we're looking at consciousness as an emergent property, as something that emerges from a series of processes. As an emergent property, consciousness, as an emergent property, consciousness is dependent on another set of processes, which are these 5 layers that we're going to be talking about. But can they be entirely reduced to those things? We don't know. So systems theory, from which this word emergence comes, talks about when certain things come together, there are certain properties that emerge which are not found in any of the constituent elements. For example, water. Water is H2O and it's got wetness. But is the wetness of water found in hydrogen or oxygen? No, it isn't. It's an emergent property. It is something that has come into being after they combine together to form the water molecule. So consciousness, in our perspective, is an emergent property. That's how we're going to be looking at it. So what are these? So in short, what I'm saying is that at any given time, these 5 levels are working. It's not that some work at some point and others don't work at other points. At any given time, 5 levels are working, which comes to us, our next assumption being that information is processed at different levels, and they're not all something that we're aware of at any given time. Our awareness may be on any one thing, but this awareness itself is an emergent property which has 5 levels that we're going to be talking about. What is the first level? The first level is the transactional awareness. In Indian philosophy, we call it the Vyavaharika Loka. Vyavahara means transaction. Vyavaharika Loka is a transactional world. What is a transactional world? The transactional world is a world with which we interact. It's logical, it's rational, time is linear there. When I say, look, I will meet you tomorrow, it means that it's something that's going to happen. It's not something that's already happened. So logic matters, sentence construction matters, all of that. The normal day-to-day world that we live in. It's also got things that rules that we use to process information in order to bring it to our awareness. Now, it's an important thing to realize here that our awareness can't look at too many things at a given time. So information is processed, it's actually reduced and brought down to a much smaller subset so that our consciousness can work on it. I'll come to that in a minute. So level 1 of the 5 levels, level 1 at the most top level is the transactional world that you and I are in on a day-to-day basis. Our relationships, our conversations, our, going to the shop, selecting something, all of that is at the transactional world. The next level is what is called the symbolic world. The symbolic world is a world of the metaphor, right? It's not logical. It is a world of arts, poetry. When you say that, look, I've given my heart away, certainly doesn't mean that my heart is not in my chest. It's certainly not a discussion about the physical aspect of my pump that pumps blood around me. And if you take it logically, it makes no sense at all. How could you give your heart away? How could you be heartbroken because somebody just left you? I mean, it's not logical, right? These are the levels of the metaphor. Now, as we go through these levels, I need you to understand that each level is more fundamental. You cannot have a rational level without the metaphoric level, but you can have a metaphoric level without the rational level. So we're going deeper and deeper, and the surface levels are possible because of the deeper level. So the second layer that we talked about is a symbolic layer. Now the third layer is the emotional layer. It's a time when you're so overcome with feeling that you don't know how to express it. And it's not just at those times, it's in other times too, when we look at something and there is an emotional level to it. If you look at the brain structure, for example, our perception of a thing is also connected to our emotional centers, which is our hippocampus, our brain centers where emotions are also expressed. So perception of a thing, if you do not have an emotional response to perception of a thing, then that thing becomes, I don't know, dull, it becomes ordinary, in fact, you may not even notice it, because in our world there are 100,000 things that are constantly there, and it is this emotional valence, if you would like to say, which allows us to focus on certain things and not on certain other things. So emotion, so symbolic cannot exist unless there are emotional valence to things. And when I say emotional balance, remember, I'm not talking about the times when you're heartbroken or when you're super happy or something. It's a normal day-to-day thing. We are looking at different layers that you are processing information right now, and that is the next level that we did, is the emotional layer. Now we've come to another layer called the unconscious. The unconscious layer had a bad reputation because Freud was the guy who popularized the concept of the unconscious, and he talked about the libido, he talked about suppressed things, But here we're not talking about that. Any processing that we do that we are not aware of is at the unconscious level. A good example is what is called the cocktail conversation or binaural hearing, binaural hearing. Here's the thing. You're at a cocktail conversation at a party and you're having a conversation with somebody in front of you, and somebody behind you mentions your name, and bingo, you turn around and said, "Did you just say my name?" How did that happen? It happened because at the same time you're processing information from the person in front of you, you're also processing information about the conversation that's happening behind you. At least processing it to the level where you can recognize your name from the set of sounds that you're there, right? At some level, we process that information, but we don't bring it to the consciousness, and we discard that information as not important. So, yes, there is an unconscious stream of processing happens. Remember, if you're listening to that conversation, also you're listening to the one on this side and that side as well. So we're looking at multiple conversations happening at the same time, being processed, but by the time it comes to our consciousness, only one of them is processed. So at any given time, our brain is processing far more information than just one stream that we are aware of, right? So these are the unconscious processing. And the final thing is the awareness, is the I that's aware of all of this, okay? For example, when you're sitting there and you're looking at over the sky and you see a beautiful ocean beneath it, blue ocean, white sky, right? Who is the you that's seeing all of this? There is a perceiver, there is a awareness, and that is only pointing outwards. The awareness of who I am, of the awareness that looks at myself is not it. My awareness looks at different things, and that different thing once can be me also. I could be looking at the mirror, and that's also another thing that we're looking at. This is the I, or the cogito, that Descartes said, I think, therefore I exist. So it's, if I am to do anything, then I exist, okay? There may not be a clear definition of that I. There are no attributes, there are no description of that I. It's only a pure awareness, and that lies at the heart of all this. 5 levels that we looked at, and we just finished going through all of them. Please go through this. I'll put a picture at the end so that you know what those 5 levels are. Thank you.